Two big stories, I suppose, overnight. One, the Labour win in Hamilton, which was unexpected at the very least. I mean, I saw polls even towards the beginning of the day, which said this is a fight between the SNP and Reform. Reform have done brilliantly. Reform have managed to catch up. They've capitalised on the fact that Hamilton, which is a very working class part of sort of the outskirts of Glasgow, if you like, and it seemed as though when Nigel Farage went up there the other day, that everybody was cheering for, Reform on, and so Labour kind of came out of nowhere to win it, didn't they?
No, absolutely. This wasn't what people were expecting. There was a lot of debate about whether or not Reform could push Labour into third place, perhaps even nick it. I mean, it's still worth saying it's a very respectable.
Reform did very well, yeah.
You know, absolutely, especially because
the trouble is the expectations for them are so high because they appear to be dominating every conversation at the moment in politics, don't they?
No, completely. You would, you know, it's easy to forget the fact this party wasn't around a few years ago, and also the idea that it was going to make inroads into Scotland, that's brand new. No one thought that was going to happen, you know, because of the fact that Nigel Farage's various parties have never really had much cut through there, but they're certainly getting cut through now. It was a surprise win for Labour, and it's something that, of course, I'm sure Keir Starmer and Anna Sarwar will take.
I don't think even Labour expected it, did they?
No, absolutely. They looked as shocked as anyone else. So but you know, at the same time, I think it's still quite clear that from what people reported from the doorstep, from what was coming out from the campaign, is that there is still this kind of sense that Labour are a little bit missionless, whether that's north of the border or south of the border. But they've managed to get away with it this time around.
Yeah, they have. And of course, what the main, I suppose, result will be for Reform making progress in Scotland is they do have proportional representation there. So in the event that there is a major election, which I think comes next year, Reform will probably get quite a lot of MSPs in because of the way that the list system works. I mean, you know, they were only 3 or 5% behind Labour, I think, in this particular by-election, so they will get a significant boost, I would say, in the Scottish Parliament. So they could actually become part of a coalition or part of a a ruling party.
No, absolutely. Proportional representation has always been very good to Nigel Farage. It's one of the reasons that until recently, when he was starting to lead the polls, he was campaigning very much for it. So yeah, both in Scotland and in Wales, it's going to be fascinating to see how much of a foothold they can gain in Scotland.
Absolutely. And the other big story, I suppose, for us down here is front page of the Daily Telegraph. Big picture of Zia Youssef and Nigel Farage. Reform civil war over burqa ban. I don't know whether you've been speaking to anybody about what's actually been going on, but I saw an interview last night with Nigel Farage, and he was very gracious about Zia Youssef. He said, look, this is a guy who came to me years ago. He wanted to get involved in politics. You know, he gave us some money. He admitted that. We put him in charge of sort of professionalising the organisation, but he simply had enough. He said he's just, it's a very tough business. Politics isn't very nice. So there will be those, I dare say, on the Conservative and Labour side who will sort of dance on the grave of Zia Youssef and go, oh, look at this, they can't run, a piss up in a brewery, as some people would say. Apologies for that this time of the morning. But, it's the only way to describe it. But I don't see this. I mean, Farage has had, they had the knockback with Rupert Lowe. It doesn't seem to affect them terribly, does it?
I think that's a fair point insofar as Zia Youssef also, he's a kind of someone who was much more behind the scenes. Yes, he would go out and do media and so on, but the big contribution he was making was not just financial, it was organisational. He was very much charged with, this word is a bit loaded, but professionalising the party, building out its infrastructure, all of which I think it seems to have been incredibly successful if you look at the way in which they've been able to continue to take the fight to Labour. So it's not necessarily that there's going to be kind of swathes of voters who feel like their man has been removed, but I still think it could be consequential because of the fact that he brought something which Reform didn't have before, which is someone with that organisational now, someone with a sense of like building this thing out, in not just being a kind of campaigning organisation, but actually becoming a party. So that may well impact them, but I think it's not something that's necessarily going to show up in the polls or is going to be, the talk down the dog and duck.
But it's interesting, isn't it? Because it does seem as though people do fall out with Nigel Farage, but he kind of continues to be the man in place. And I don't know whether it was about the burqa ban. I mean, there was a very sort of bizarre series of tweets that went on after Sarah Poaching made that intervention in Parliament, when she asked the question, basically, would Keir Starmer, consider banning the burqa? And as I said, there was this ridiculous kind of sharp intake of breath from everybody. They were like, oh my goodness me, how could you ask that question? He then put out a tweet saying, I think, initially, or somebody did, that it wasn't Reform policy. And he then put out a tweet later saying it was a bit dumb to actually ask a question of a party when you weren't going to do it yourself. And I mean, that just seemed a bit provocative unnecessarily, didn't it?
And also, I suppose it's one of those things where clearly not being on the same page about this particular issue. It also exposes him to looking a bit stupid, because if you make that kind of comment and then you followed up by the fact that Nigel Farage seemed to, if not endorse the policy per se, certainly, you know, suggest that that's something you could be open to. It just looked like a bit of a mess. I imagine what happened here was that Zia Yusuf, he was saying he's, you know, been working, you know, non-stop trying to build out this party. We're getting an awful lot of flack for doing so, not from people outside Reform, but also from people inside Reform.
Well, during the whole Rupert Lowe row, he was the one that was getting blamed for it, wasn't it? And people were saying, you know, Zia Yusuf's the problem, Zia Yusuf is the guy that's causing all of this, and this is why Rupert Lowe's fallen out. I mean, Rupert Lowe is a curious individual, I don't think there's any doubt about that. You know, and he's been, you know, telling people, I mean, he had a go at me the other week. He said, there's no need to be unpleasant. When I said, why are you doing interviews with Emily Maitlis when you don't come on Talk? And I said, you're not as important as you think you are. And he went, how are you being so unpleasant? And only just the other day, somebody asked him a question. He went, you're obviously a nutter. And I thought, well, you know, if you're talking about being unpleasant to people, why are you calling people nutters on, you know, on social media? So, you know, it's all much of a muchness. But as I say, there will be people who will sort of feast on this and go, Reform are finished. They can't organise anything. But in fact, I don't believe that to be the case.
No, absolutely. And it's one of those. Also, this is a unique one insofar as this isn't Nigel Farage cutting down another tall poppy, as people would like to call it. He's clearly had enough. I think that seems to be a combination of the amount of work he was putting in. It's quite a thankless task. He was getting a lot of abuse from all sides. Despite the fact that, as we were talking about, he made a really significant contribution to this party in a way that was a little bit unsung, I think. And I think you saw the fact that Farage responded kind of more in sadness than in anger would indicate that this did come out of the blue. It probably was a combination of factors. Again, that the burqa issue seeming to at least expose a lack of coherence in the party, and him saying it wasn't party policy, but then other MPs almost implying that it was. Maybe that was just the straw that broke the camel's back.
I said at the time, I can't believe Sarah Poaching would have asked that question without Nigel Farage knowing she was going to ask that question. I mean, he was sitting right next to her. The only person in between them was Richard Tice. I'm sure he knew, and he came on the show yesterday and said basically, look, you know, obviously we're not a party which guarantees that everybody thinks the same way. However, it's an important issue, and it's something that we should be debating. And I think that's a pretty sensible place for them to be, isn't it?
And I think so. And they've done that on a couple of kind of big controversial issues. If you think about assisted dying, there's a number of the MPs in Reform who actually backed that legislation first time around, although it seems like most of them have changed their minds now. So this is one thing that they're kind of embracing, which is a level of we don't all have to be on the same page about these things. So maybe that was another example. But I think when, for whatever reason, I think this is probably one smaller thing which just made him think, you know what, I've had enough of this, and start to move on.
And I think I can imagine, and there were those who before yesterday were saying that Zia Yusuf has been kind of sidelined and he's been pushed out of the mainstream of the party to become the sort of the head of Doge, because also the other guy that they hired, this sort of new tech genius guy whose name escapes me for the moment, he's also gone. So there's obviously something going on in that area as well, because that was going to be where they were going to be scrutinised in the most probably difficult way for them, because, you know, going into all these local councils trying to work out where they'd wasted money, and it started out looking like they were doing a pretty good job. But now you have to ask who's doing that.
No, absolutely, and that's something that's worth remembering, because the local elections means that they're actually got to govern in those places and those councils that they've won. They've got to show that this sort of localised version of Doge could be actually paying dividends, and, you know, just you want that to be going to work, showing all kinds of crazy ways. That's a big operation if you're going to do that properly. So big questions about who is going to spearhead that initiative now that Yusuf is on the way.
Yeah, absolutely right. Let's remind ourselves of how this all started. Sarah Poaching on Prime Minister's Questions, asking this question on the burqa.
Given the Prime Minister's desire to strengthen strategic alignment with our European neighbours, will he, in the interests of public safety, follow the lead of France, Denmark, Belgium and others and ban the burqa?
Yeah. Prime Minister.
Can I welcome her to her place? But I'm not going to follow her down that line. But now she is here and safely in her place, perhaps she could tell her new party leader that his latest plan to bet £80 billion of unfunded tax cuts, with no idea how he's going to pay for it, is Liz Truss all over again. Although, considering I think she was a Conservative member when Liz Truss was leader, she probably won't.
Yeah, I mean, Starman didn't handle that very well either, because the Prime Minister's questions don't bother answering it.
Yeah.
You know, people have said since then, why didn't you just say, no, I don't actually want to ban the burqa, because I don't think that's the sort of way that we should be proceeding, instead of which he just avoids the whole question.
No, and it wasn't even his pre-prepared lines he stumbled across along with. That's the thing about Starmer, he's so not sure-footed. And as you say, just answer the question. There's a perfectly legitimate case to be made, even if you don't like the burqa, even if you do think it's a misogynistic garment, say, well, it's not the role of the government to tell people what they should wear. Just say it, but he can't. He just has to go back to the script every time.
Yeah, exactly right. And this is what Zia Yusuf put out after that. He said, nothing to do with me. I had no idea about the question, nor that it wasn't policy, busy with other stuff. I do think it's dumb for a party to ask the Prime Minister if they would do something the party itself wouldn't do. And I think that perhaps caused something of a rift, because you would imagine if he's calling the newest Reform MP, Sarah Poaching, dumb, that's not a great look for the chairman of the party.
It's not, no, and it's one of those things where it might have been a kind of hastily drafted tweet. To be honest, though, it's the sort of thing that I can imagine could have been smoothed over. Yeah. I think probably the key thing here is he has been working at this. He's new to politics as well. This is something that he's kind of hopped into this arena relatively recently. I'm not saying he bit off more than he can chew, but he's clearly got other things that he would probably perhaps want to be getting on with. You know, he's a very successful businessman, and because of the fact that it has been a bit of a thankless task at times, and you know the brickbats that you get in all directions, maybe this was just the thing that you know what.
It's a bit like people getting into this business, you know, when you're not really prepared for it. You know, it's you know, the bits that you don't think are going to be difficult are difficult, and the bits that you think are going to be easy are not quite so easy. He also tweeted this 12 hours ago. 11 months ago, I became chairman of Reform. I've worked full-time as a volunteer to take the party from 14 to 30%, quadrupled its membership and delivered historic electoral results. I no longer believe working to get a Reform government elected is a good use of my time, and hereby resign the office. It's quite a mysterious tweet, that, you know. What do you mean it's not a good use of your time?
And you're forced to kind of read between the lines a little bit, aren't you? Like, is it suggesting that that's something that he's not as interested in getting Reform elected as previously? It leaves so many more questions.
Well, yeah, because I mean, he could have said, you know, I'm grateful to Nigel Farage for giving me the opportunity to involve myself in politics at the grassroots level, blah, 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 whatever.
I will continue to support Reform in my own way, or whatever it might be, but
there's no mention of Farage, there's no mention of the party that he loves, you know. I'm taking my leave of it because, you know, I've got other things going on. I mean, it's quite a sort of I would say, gnarly tweet, sort of a bit bitter. Yeah,
and without wanting to sort of speculate on people's circumstances and stuff, there is something in politics at the moment where people jump in and jump out at the slightest opportunity. I'm sure we'll get on to what's been going on in America.
Well, we certainly will,
but there's a parallel there where people, for whatever reason, there's not as much staying power as there used to be, and people aren't in it for the long game as much as they used to.
Well, Christian and I were talking about it, my producer, and we, you know, they all seem very thin-skinned now, don't they? It's like, you know, what do you mean? And I said, you know, it's a bit like me waking up one morning and putting a tweet out about my boss or about my producer, going, you know, he's a bit of a dickhead. I don't know why I work with him. You know, I'm sorry. You know, oh, sorry, mate. Everything's fine. And then you go, well, no, it's not fine, actually. You've just called me a bad name on social media, you know. Anyway, let's have a look at what Reform was like in happier times.
I'd like to introduce you to the leader of Reform UK, the Member of Parliament for Clacton-on-Sea, and the next Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Mr Nigel Farage.
Good morning, everybody. How fortunate I've been, or perhaps it was just good judgment, in picking Zia as party chairman, because the big thing we had to do after the last general election was to professionalise the party, and we've done that.
And of course, we have done that, as he says, but he now has to look for another chairman. And who will that person be? What sort of person will it be? Who will he look at? What sort of individuals would qualify to do that sort of job, you know? Because everybody can see, it looks to me anyway, that Nigel Farage is Reform still.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And it's one of those things where Reform's big challenge now, because they've clearly got the populist energy, they've clearly got, they're clearly making the political weather in a way that they have previously. They do now need to attract really kind of high calibre individuals to build out the party and potentially then to sort of govern. And I think when Zia Yusuf came on board, it was an indication that maybe they could attract those kinds of people. He's a very impressive person, very successful person, clearly very determined until he hopped out quite inauspiciously. But so that's going to be the question now, is that can they continue to attract people who can really help them build on what they've started?
And as I say, what happens to this new sort of, you know, Reform Doge operation, which was effectively being run by Zia Yusuf? I mean, until yesterday morning, he was still tweeting out things about, you know, local councils where he discovered incredible amounts of waste, which was a great job that he was doing. You know, so somebody now has to come in and do that.
Yeah.
Because, as I say, the other guy, Nathaniel, what's his name? Nathaniel Reid, Freed, has gone as well. So it's all smoke and mirrors. Let's get a voice note from James.
Good morning, Mike. Now, bloody Starmer and Rachel Reeves, they sound even worse than what they normally bloody sound like. And I thought this bloody plonker Starmer, he was supposed to be a human rights lawyer. Now, surely you have to learn how to speak properly. My God, Mike. I tell you what, Mike, he sounds like the bloody old AOL dial-up internet. Jesus Christ, give me strength. Anyway, Mike, just like to say, morning glory, best breakfast show on the planet. Thanks, Mike. Have a lovely weekend.
James, thank you very much indeed. The weekend does indeed begin here. Yeah, I mean, I said this yesterday. Plank of the Week goes out, of course, tonight at 7 o'clock. We recorded it the other day. Plank of the Week, I said, you know, Starmer is now apparently doing an impression of me, doing an impression of him. When he stood up at Prime Minister, he couldn't actually answer anything.